almost 200 years, the ocean liner has evoked images of romance and adventure on the high seas. In peacetime, liners have evoked images of travel and adventure. They have become inextricably linked with kings, presidents, and movie stars. In times of war, they have forged vital links between allies and united far-flung empires. This is a story of vision and boundless ambition, a story of technological innovation, disaster on the high seas, and standards in luxury that have never been equaled. This is a story of steam, steel, and style. This is the story of the great Atlantic liners. Even though ships have been transporting people since time immemorial, it was not until the early 19th century that the first attempt to provide scheduled service between Europe and North America took place. The Blackball Line consisted of a fleet of 4 packet ships owned by a group of Quaker merchants. In its 60-year history, the Blackball Line operated some of the most famous vessels from the Age of Sail, including the Lightning, the Indian Queen, and the Marco Polo. However, sailing vessels such as those used by the Blackball Line were still subject to the vagaries of wind and weather, but all that was about to change. In 1818, a new packet ship lay half-completed on the ways at the New York shipyard of Fickett and Crocker. Around the same time, Captain Moses Rogers successfully persuaded the Savannah, Georgia shipping firm of Scarborough and Isaacs to purchase the uncompleted vessel and convert her into a steamship, with the aim of launching the world's first transatlantic steamship service. Accordingly, the Savannah, as she would be known, was fitted with a steam engine, a boiler, and paddle wheels. Captain Rogers personally oversaw the installation of the Savannah's machinery, while his brother-in-law, Stephen Rogers, supervised the construction of the Savannah's hull and rigging. The Savannah's engine cylinder was supplied by the Allaire Iron Works of New York, while the rest of the ship's engine components were manufactured by Speedwell Iron Works in New Jersey. The Savannah was powered by a 90-horsepower low-pressure steam engine. The Savannah steam plant was considered large for her day, and Rogers had difficulties in securing a suitable boiler. Captain Rogers rejected several boilers before settling on a copper boiler built by a specialist boilersmith named Daniel Dodd. The Savannah's mechanical equipment also included 2 paddle wheels 16 feet in diameter. The fuel for her steam plant consisted of 100 tons of coal and cordwood. The Savannah was too small to carry sufficient fuel to complete a transatlantic crossing under her own power. As such, the Savannah's steam engine was only intended to be used when the ship was becalmed and the sails were unable to provide a speed of at least 4 knots. In order to reduce drag and prevent damage to her mechanical systems, the 8 buckets on the Savannah's 2 paddle wheels were linked with chains, allowing them to be folded up and stored on deck. The paddle wheel covers were made of canvas stretched over a metal framework. The system could be dismantled and stowed on deck in under 15 minutes, making the Savannah the only ship ever built with collapsible paddle wheels. The Savannah was fitted with 32 passenger berths and 16 staterooms. Men and women were housed separately. The Savannah also boasted 3 fully furnished saloons, complete with imported carpets, curtains, and decorated with mirrors. Her 16 staterooms are said to have been large and comfortable. Newspapers of the day described the Savannah as more closely resembling a private yacht than a transatlantic packet ship. However, when it became known that the Savannah was intended to operate in the Atlantic, she was quickly dubbed a steam coffin. As a result, Moses Rogers was unable to hire a crew and was forced to travel to New London, Connecticut, where he had an established reputation as a competent mariner. The Savannah conducted a successful trial run of her steam engine in New York Harbor on March 22, 1819. On March 28th, she began her maiden voyage under full sail, heading out of New York Harbor for her home port of Savannah, Georgia. The following morning, a head of steam was built up in the Savannah's engine for the first time. However, the steam plant was only in use for half an hour before rough weather persuaded Captain Rogers to stow the paddle wheels. The Savannah reached her destination on April 6, having used her steam engine for a total of 41.5 hours during the 207-hour voyage. She eventually arrived at her berth at 4 a.m. Despite the early hour, a large crowd had gathered to welcome the Savannah into port. Around the same time, President James Monroe was in Charleston, South Carolina, as part of an inspection of fortification and public works along the Atlantic coast. Upon learning of the visit, one of the Savannah's owners, William Scarborough, instructed Captain Rogers to sail north to Charleston and invite Monroe to sail back to Savannah aboard the steamship. The Savannah made steam and headed for Charleston, arriving 2 days later. Scarborough's invitation was sent, but locals objected and President Monroe was forced to decline the invitation, promising to visit the ship at a later date. On May 7th, while the Savannah was taking on fuel, President Monroe arrived to make good on his promise of an excursion aboard the Savannah. After the presidential entourage was welcomed aboard, the Savannah departed under steam for Tibby Lighthouse at 8 a.m., arriving there at 10:30 and making the return journey to her berth at 11 a.m. Monroe dined on board, where he expressed enthusiasm to the ship's owners that the first transatlantic steamship service was an American enterprise. Monroe was impressed with the ship's machinery and invited the Savannah's owners to bring her to Washington after her transatlantic crossing, so Congress could inspect the Savannah with the intent of purchasing her for use as a cruiser against Cuban pirates. After Monroe and the presidential entourage had departed the Savannah, Captain Rogers and the rest of the crew made the final preparations for the Savannah's first transatlantic crossing. The Savannah's owners made every effort to secure passengers and cargo for the crossing, but no one would risk their lives or property on such an unproven vessel. The Savannah's May 20th departure was delayed by 2 days when a member of the crew returned to the ship drunk, fell from the gangplank, and drowned. In spite of the fact that no one was willing to sail on her, Captain Rogers and the ship's owners decided to attempt the crossing anyways in an experimental capacity. The Savannah began her voyage on May 24, 1819 at 5 a.m. when she set out from the Tybee Island lighthouse under sail and steam for Liverpool. Her paddle wheels were stowed at 8 a.m. and she continued under sail alone. She was spotted several days later by the schooner Contract. The log of the Contract indicates that the crew spotted a ship with volumes of smoke issuing. The Contract's captain assumed that he had found a ship on fire and gave chase. After several hours, the Contract was not able to catch the Savannah, and the captain of the Contract concluded that the mystery ship must be a steamboat bound for Europe. In the ship's log, the Contract's captain described a proud moment of Yankee skill and enterprise. On June 2nd, the Savannah was sighted again, this time by the sailing ship Pluto. The crew of the Pluto gave the Savannah 3 cheers as the happiest effort of mechanical genius that ever sailed the Western Sea. The Savannah was sighted for a 3rd time on June 19th off the coast of Ireland, this time by the British cutter HMS Kite. The captain of the Kite made the same assumption that the captain of the Contract had made 3 weeks earlier and assumed that the Savannah was on fire. Unable to catch the Savannah, the Kite fired a warning shot, and Captain Rogers brought the Savannah to a halt, at which point the commander of the Kite asked permission to board and inspect the Savannah. The Savannah's log indicates that the British sailors were much gratified by the satisfaction of their curiosity. On June 18th, the Savannah was becalmed off of Cork, having run out of fuel for her steam plant. On June 20th, she made her way to Liverpool, where she was greeted by a flotilla of boats. Upon approaching the city, the Savannah was greeted by cheering crowds thronging the piers and the rooftops. The Savannah's crossing had lasted 29 days and 11 hours. During that time, the Savannah's steam engine had run for 80 hours. The Savannah remained in Liverpool for 25 days. During that time, the ship was visited by thousands of people from all walks of life, including officers from the Army and the Navy. Reflecting the suspicion that still lingered after the War of 1812, some British observers believed that the Savannah had been built to rescue Napoleon from the island of St. Helena. While in Liverpool, the crew scraped and repainted the ship, replenished their fuel and supplies, and tested the engine. On July 21st, the Savannah set sail again, bound for St. Petersburg, Russia. The Savannah reached Elsinore, Denmark on August 9th, where she was quarantined for 5 days. On August 14th, she proceeded to Stockholm, Sweden, where she became the first steamship to enter the Baltic Sea. The Savannah arrived at Stockholm on August 22nd, where she remained for 2 weeks. On August 28th, the ship was visited by Oscar, the Prince of Sweden and Norway. On September 1st, Captain Rogers took the royal entourage and a delegation of nobles and foreign diplomats on a day cruise to some nearby islands. Around the same time, the Swedish government offered to buy the Savannah. However, the terms were not attractive enough and Captain Rogers refused. After receiving gifts of a stone and muller, the Savannah set sail for Kronstadt, Russia. The Savannah arrived in Kronstadt on September 9th. Upon arriving, the Tsar of Russia came aboard and presented Captain Rogers with a watch and 2 iron chairs. From Kronstadt, the Savannah sailed for St. Petersburg, arriving on September 13th. During the journey from England to Russia, the Savannah's steam engine saw its most frequent use, running for a total of 241 hours. While in St. Petersburg, the American ambassador to Russia extended an invitation to a number of prominent citizens to visit the ship. The Savannah conducted 3-day cruises in the waters around St. Petersburg for members of the Russian royal family, the Russian nobility, and observers from the army and the navy. As with Sweden, the Russian government expressed an interest in purchasing the Savannah, but again, Captain Rogers declined the offer. On September 27th, the Savannah began to take on fuel and stores for her voyage back to the United States. Before her departure, Lord Lydenach, who had traveled aboard the Savannah from Stockholm to St. Petersburg, presented gifts of a silver coffee pot and a gold snuff box to Captain Rogers and his brother-in-law, the Savannah's sailing master Stephen Rogers. On September 29th, the Savannah set sail from Kronstadt. While in Kronstadt, she was delayed by bad weather. The Savannah left under steam on October 10th, arriving in Copenhagen, Denmark, 7 days later. While in Copenhagen, the Savannah took on a pilot who directed the ship to a safe anchorage off the coast of Norway. From Arendal, Norway, the Savannah set off on the homeward leg of her voyage. She experienced gales and high seas for almost the entire crossing and could not use her steam engine until she was back in her home waters. She steamed up the Savannah River and arrived at her berth at 10 a.m. on November 30th, 6 months and 8 days after she had left. The Savannah remained in her home port until December 3rd, at which point she set sail for Washington, D.C., arriving on December 16th. In January 1820, the city of Savannah was ravaged by a fire, and the Savannah's owners, the shipping firm of Scarborough and Isaac, suffered financially as a result of the fire and were forced to sell their ship. Her steam engine was removed and resold to the Allaire Iron Works, which had built the engine. The cylinder was preserved and later displayed in the New York Crystal Palace exhibition of 1856. Following the removal of her mechanical systems, the Savannah was employed as a traditional packet ship, operating between New York and Savannah, Georgia. On November 5, 1821, the Savannah ran aground in a storm off Long Island. She subsequently broke apart and sank. The Savannah demonstrated that it was possible for a steamship to cross an ocean. However, the public was not ready to trust steam technology on the open sea. It would be 18 years before steamships began making regular crossings on the North Atlantic. By the 1830s, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The arrival of the railroad meant that steam had come of age. By the late 1830s, the Great Western Railway was the longest railway line in Britain. In 1837, the board of directors was summoned to a meeting in which it was proposed that the company build a railway line from London to Bristol. When one of the company directors complained that a railway line to Bristol was too long, the company's chief engineer responded by saying that this was too short. The chief engineer of the Great Western Railway was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Born in Portsmouth in 1806, the 31-year-old Brunel had already made a name for himself building the Thames Tunnel and the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Brunel proposed the construction of a steamship that would connect the railway with a transoceanic steamship service to New York. The board of directors was taken aback by this radical suggestion. Nevertheless, it took Brunel's proposal under consideration. After a number of discussions and economic calculations, the board returned and gave Brunel permission to build a steamship. The new ship was to be constructed in the shipyard of William Patterson in Bristol. As the first ever purpose-built Atlantic liner, she would be the largest ship ever built. The Great Western, as she would eventually be known, was 212 feet long. Weighing 1,340 tons with a service speed of 9 knots, she would carry 148 passengers. The Great Western was constructed of wood and reinforced with iron bolts. She was powered by a 750 horsepower 2-cylinder Maudslay steam engine, turning 2 large paddle wheels. When the Great Western Railway announced plans to launch a transatlantic steamship service between Bristol and New York, it suddenly found itself in a race. With the backing of an American businessman named Junius Smith, the British and American Steam Navigation Company set out to construct a transatlantic liner of their own. However, the construction of their ship, the Royal Victoria, was plagued with delays, and it quickly became apparent that she would not be ready in time. Instead of waiting for the Royal Victoria, the British and American Steam Navigation Company chartered the Sirius, with the intent of using her to make the crossing. The Sirius was a 700-ton coastal steamer that ordinarily operated between London and Cork. On March 29, 1838, the Sirius departed London bound for New York. She made a brief stop at Queenstown to pick up passengers, and as much fuel as she could carry, including 2 large heaps of coal on deck. The Sirius was not designed to cross oceans, and she would require significant amounts of fuel. At the same time that the Sirius was entering the open ocean on April 4th, the Great Western was still sitting at her berth in Bristol, her crew making final preparations before departure. The Great Western departed Bristol on April 8th. Meanwhile, on board the Sirius, the crew was doing everything possible to take advantage of their head start. In order to reach New York first, they had to keep the pressure in the steam engine dangerously high. While still on the open ocean, the Sirius encountered a storm, which slowed her progress and increased the consumption of coal. In a last-ditch attempt to beat the Great Western to New York, the crew of the Sirius began stripping the ship of anything that would burn. Furniture, wood paneling, and the ship's spare mast were all chopped up and fed into the furnace. The Sirius entered New York Harbor on April 22nd, becoming the first steamship to cross the Atlantic under her own power. The Great Western arrived 4 hours later. Even though the Great Western arrived after the Sirius, her crossing time was actually 4 days faster, 14 days and 12 hours as compared to the Sirius's 18 days. Additionally, the Great Western arrived in New York with 200 tons of coal left in her bunkers. Brunel had demonstrated that a sufficiently large steamship could carry enough fuel to complete a transatlantic crossing and have enough additional space for passengers and cargo. The Great Western was capable of carrying 148 passengers in comfort and luxury. Like the Savannah 20 years before her, the Great Western's interiors more closely resembled those of a private yacht than a transatlantic packet ship. The Great Western's dining saloon was the finest on the Atlantic, decorated with murals in the Watteau style. Passengers in need of assistance could summon a steward with the pull of a bell rope. Following her maiden voyage, the Great Western entered regular service on the Atlantic. In order to capitalize on their success, the Great Western Railroad would be required to build more ships like the Great Western. Instead, Brunel embarked on the construction of a bigger ship, the Great Britain. In 1846, having made 64 crossings, the Great Western was laid up. A year later, she was sold to the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, where she continued to operate for an additional 9 years. In 1853, the Great Western was requisitioned by the British government, along with a number of other steamships, for use as troop transports in the Crimean War. Following the end of the war, in 1856, advances in technology had rendered the Great Western obsolete, and she was sold for scrap. The Great Western's last voyage was to the shipbreakers in Vauxhall, London, where she was cut up for scrap.